She was fantastic company. When you caught sight of her at a political convention, you realized that you were going to have some fun, regardless of how long the speeches went on. When the Nation magazine's cruise stopped in St. Thomas, the thought of spending the day in what is essentially a shopping mall with sun could be brightened by Molly organizing an expedition looking for what she called, as I remember, slutty shoes. She responded to having cancer the way you would have expected her to. If there's anything a Texas liberal knows about, it's continuing to fight even when the odds are stacked against you. When she was given an award in New York not that long ago, she used her acceptance speech to tell the story of trying to find a prosthetic breast in Paris, hers having been lost in some misdirected luggage. As I remember Molly's description of her efforts to communicate, the French phrase she used for prosthetic breast was something like, "that from which the baby sucks, except a false one of that from which the baby sucks." And the items offered by puzzled clerks, including a baby bottle and a glass eye. In other words, she cussed cancer and she analyzed cancer, and being Molly, she even made fun of cancer. Weren't she a caution? She always was having a good time, and I think that somebody could cover the Texas legislature, say, and find it dispiriting, but Molly found it funny, and would write things like, "If his IQ falls any further, you'll have to water him twice a day," and that sort of thing. So she was a wonderful writer. I mean, she had a great style, and often was funny, and often was moving. I think I mentioned in that eulogy a wonderful piece that she did on visiting the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington and looking for the name of a young man she had known. So she was just a good writer, and but also she was sharp. I mean, she understood what was happening in the Iraq War before it started from Austin. She didn't need to see all the cables. She was absolutely right about it.
Texas seems to be a state that takes its myths more seriously than other states, and that's been one explanation for why we remain such a conservative, dominated state politically, that there's this idea of individualism over communitarianism. Do you think that that's true? I mean, you have more perspective on the whole country than
I think that those myths do mean something, I mean, whether they're true or not. And I was saying today somewhere else that if you're in a hotel in like yesterday, I was at the hotel and a guy walked in. He had on jeans, he had on boots, he had on one of those $1,200 belts, and a cowboy hat or whatever you call that. And it's quite possible that he had just moved down from Detroit 2 years ago. But it doesn't make any difference because he sort of buys into the prevailing culture. And I did a story once in Rhodesia, then known as Rhodesia, a year after they declared unilateral declaration of independence from England. And people in the colonial office, I mean, told me before I left London that, well, these people will fold in a minute. They had some sanctions, and they said, you know, they all talk about having fought the Matabele and gathered their wagons around and everything like that, but in fact they're just a bunch of clerks from Birmingham who went in after the war because they couldn't make it here, or they wanted a servant or a swimming pool. Well, statistically they were right. That's who those people were, but that's not who they thought they were. They thought they were these people who had fought the Matabele, and you could show very easily that most of them hadn't even been there before the Second World War, and and that the colonial office guys were right about them, but they behaved like they fought them at Abele. And so I do think the myths are important, and I think symbols are important. In fact, if you did a study of Texas to find out how many rich, boastful oil men there are in Texas, or how many cowboys, you might find a very small percentage, but that doesn't mean that a lot of Texans don't think of themselves as those people.
You have a satirical essay from 1987, the last time Texas had a budget crisis that's comparable to what it has now. And, you know, when you look at, that was a very serious crisis. I think it was a $10 million deficit. And now, you know, we're looking at cutting $9 billion in Medicaid, $8 billion from public schools. You know, the idea that cutting public libraries is a bad thing is just, you know, way in the past. Seems almost quaint.
Right.
We've now gone through, you know, 30 years of government slashing, the idea that government is the problem. Do you see that? Do you see that turning around, and how will that turn around?
I'm not sure that I do see it turning around, and partly because I think that the Democrats don't really take the offensive the way they should. And, you know, there's nobody who doesn't think some government is wasteful. I mean, obviously it is, and obviously when you do things in government, partly to keep it fair or keep it uncorrupt if possible, you have to do sort of broad stroke things, and sometimes it's easy to point out, well, you shouldn't be supporting this or this or that. On the other hand, when you think of this, say, the fact that GE doesn't pay any taxes. I mean, we're really talking about billions of dollars. This one company, it doesn't pay any taxes. I wrote a poem saying that the best thing they brought to life were those tax attorneys, you know, who figured out how the rest of us have to pay taxes for them. I remember I live in Canada in the summer, and during the argument about the health care, people constantly brought up the problems of the Canadian national health, socialized medicine. Well, it does have problems. However, it was interesting to me that when the CBC asked who is the greatest Canadian of all in the history of Canadians, historical figures, everybody, Wayne Gretzky did not win. The man who won was Tommy Douglas, who you never heard of. Tommy Douglas, in addition to being Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather, was the premier of Saskatchewan, province that is often the subject of jokes, and put in universal health care, and then went into the federal government and fought for it to be universal health care in the federal government. He was a socialist. He is considered by I don't know the methodology of this. Maybe he's only finished second or third, really, if you count the votes better. But he is, according to the CBC, the greatest Canadian. Well, if they hate it so much, why are they making him the greatest Canadian? Again, the healthcare thing is you know, stuck on ideology, because then we were told, do you really want a bureaucrat deciding whether you could get the operation? So now what we have is a bureaucrat deciding that, except the bureaucrat happens to be working for an insurance company instead of the government, and the head of the insurance company is making off with $12 or $15 million a year in salary. So, I mean, there are other countries like France and other countries that have single-payer systems that aren't like England's or something. They're obviously more efficient ways to do this. As you probably know, as I understand it, the current health care, the idea of tying health benefits to jobs came about accidentally in the Second World War, when there was a wage and price control, and companies were trying to lure workers, and so they started luring them with giving them health coverage. So it was an accident. I mean, that whole system is obviously not an efficient way to do it. And also, if a person loses his job, he loses his health care coverage, and his family loses his health care coverage. So it's a crazy system, but when I think of how it could be reformed beyond what Obama's done, and I'm all for making it. I mean, when you think about it, we've been close to something called the Hole in the Wall Gang Camp. My wife was on the board, and we used to go there as counselors one session every year. We've got kids who are hemophiliacs who have to have factor VIII prophylactically to keep from having these awful bleeds. And if they have that, if the blood supply is okay, which it now is, they can lead a pretty normal life. But previously, when they got to, I don't know, 20 or something, they were off the insurance of their parents, and they couldn't get their own insurance because they had a pre-existing condition. Well, I mean, that's stupid. I mean, there has to be some way. So the fact that now it's up to 26 in this new law, and you can't refuse people, I mean, I think that's all to the good. And you know, the Massachusetts law, as I understand the Massachusetts law, was pretty close to this. Now, Romney's trying to run. I did a poem about Romney during the campaign. It said, yes, Mitt's so slick of speech and slick of garb, he reminds us all of Ken from Ken and Barbie, so quick to shed his moderate regalia. Like Ken, he may be lacking genitalia.
Do you see a future for the kind of journalism that you were able to do in the New Yorker and that the Observer has done?
I think that the kind of reporting the Observer has done, which is often on government and politics and serious issues, I think that there's always going to be some of that, even if it comes by grants from people. And I know I've talked to 3 or 4 people in the last few months who have been involved in setting up places to do, like the Nation Institute does some of that stuff. And whether somebody's going to have the luxury to do this sort of stuff I did for the New Yorker, where you say, well, what's the point of doing a story that long on a film critic, or the alter ego of a film critic, and not even the film critic? I sometimes wonder. Fortunately, I'm not going to have to worry about that. I will be building birdhouses or whatever you do when you're in your dotage in retirement. I don't know when that's ever going to happen, but I won't have to worry about it.